to start?
Yes. Shall we begin?
Yeah, please.
Welcome, everyone. I would like to try to make this a rapid presentation on my part. I'm hoping that most of you have had a chance to see the video that Jason sent out the link to several times. And based on that, I'm just going to scamper through the presentation. Since I'm relatively new to the group, this slide is by way of introducing myself. I started working for the Navy in 1964 in the Weapons Systems Analysis Office, and the bosses told me later their decision was, well, he's a Harvard grad and a Marine. I think we can teach him systems analysis. So they hired me, which I'm thankful for. By 1972, I had worked in a number of places, and fortuitously, I got to head the US delegation to the United Nations First World Conference on Informatics and Government, Des Informatiques, in Florence, which was great. In the 90s, it was even better, hanging out with Stuart Umpleby, and I met Paul Pangaro then. In 93, I was one of 3 civil servants who was recruited to help manage Al Gore's National Performance Review. Am I all right? And spent the better part of a year and came back a little bit later working on that, another story. This by way of saying that I had a fair amount of experience over my career as a federal silver serpent. So I know a little bit about this government thing, worked at 7 cabinet departments, as well as 7 different agencies. And as I say, I couldn't hold a job, but they paid me every 2 weeks anyway, which was good. Next slide, please. At one of the American Society for Cybernetics conferences, I met and had my picture taken with Stafford Beer. And I think that the key here from one of the books about his viable system model is that survival is a function of the total organization of any system that does survive and includes its capacity to learn, to adapt, to evolve. And I don't think government is doing that very well, but I do treasure that picture. Next slide, please. And this is one of my favorite quotes, but it goes back a long ways to 1966. I won't read the whole thing. The last paragraph says, the biggest single need in computer technology and everything else now is not for improved circuitry or enlarged capacity or prolonged memory or miniaturized containers, but for better questions and better use of the answers. And I think what we need in the design of government is better questions and better use of the answers. Next slide, please. And we talk about unintended consequences, and Forrester talked about counterintuitive consequences. And this is one that struck me and has stayed with me my entire life. In 68, I was traveling for the Office of Economic Opportunity in upstate Louisiana, which I can't recommend even today, and found that the people there really liked the food stamp program, which was constructed by Northern senators and congressmen to be a substitute for the old commodities distribution program. And I didn't understand off the top of my head why they liked it so much in the South. But I found out by asking questions that the food stamp program, first, it enriched the local storekeepers. Second, it permitted both the hiring of white female clerks and the firing of black warehousemen, which they were in favor of, and was also driving the poorest of the poor out of the state. They could not afford the required minimal cash payments for the food stamps. And of course, their source of commodities had been shut off, which seems to me is a pretty bad design of government. Anyway, certainly unintended consequences from the perception of the Northern congressmen and senators who passed the program. Next slide, please. So starting in there somewhere, I became obsessed with the design of government issue. All of these papers that are listed are on my website. First, I wrote one for the Orsa Timms meeting in '77, and then there's some other papers that are on my website, as I said, and then we've done a handful of presentations. You were asked to look at the one in 2015 with Stuart at George Washington. George Richardson, who's SUNY Albany and a student of Jay Forrester, and I taught a course at Chautauqua in 2017. I did a quick presentation in Anne Arundel Community College, and then Stuart and I have done 2 presentations with the Policy Studies Organization here in Washington as recently as December of 2019. So there's a lot of written material on the website as well as the videos. Next slide, please. And you know, you go through all the stuff that we've talked about, we're continuing to talk about. Excuse me. The Army uses the term VUCA. I mentioned Forrester and counterintuitive results. Silos and stovepipes are awfully common in organizations, the government in particular, and of course, positive and negative feedback loops, a whole handful of thinkers. The video presentation talks about phase 4 souvlaki, one of my favorite stories. And also during Prohibition, there were only 1,500 Bureau of Alcohol employees, and there were just tens of thousands of illegal bars. And there was no way, that's an Ashby's Law thing, there was no way that they could catch up. The 2 books that I recommend for what I would like to see in the design of government are Tools of Government, written by Lester Salomon. I helped him teach the course at Johns Hopkins for 2 years. And then A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. And I think that we're in a state now where there is big data. There should be all sorts of information about what things do and don't do. I would like to see legislative impact statements. There has been legislation for environmental impact statements. So why not legislative impact statements? And design thinking, of course, is all over the West Coast and other places as well. It's become quite big. I've got a stack of books about it. And then people talk about brainstorming and they try to distinguish that from crowdsourcing. In point of fact, I think that crowdsourcing is a form of brainstorming which isn't done in a short period of time and people don't have to be all in the same place, but it's still the same idea, sharing ideas and coming together on what works and what doesn't work. Next slide, please. And I just found out recently that there may be hope. There is something called the Evidence Act of 2018, which requires agencies to develop learning agendas, evidence building plans to assess the effectiveness of their programs. Fancy that. And there was a commission prior to that that talked about what they needed. So I think that there will be information needed to facilitate the design process. It goes back to the big data from the prior slide. But you still need choices among tools and successful patterns. So what I've tried to do is to design today's forum where we can set about designing better ways to design how government is designed. That seems recursive, but I'd like to make sure we get that to plenty of time for that discussion. So I said, let's begin, but I have one more picture. Next slide, please. This demonstrates that clever design did not originate recently. This is an actual artifact which is in the possession of a museum at Cambridge University in England. This appears to be a close equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, but it was created between 200 and 300 AD. So it's quite old. The rusty looking thing at the top and the middle is a part that was made out of an appropriate steel for a knife blade, which is rusted. But look at that. If they could design that back then, surely we can do a better job of designing government now. Jason, that's it.